Imagine you're standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down at the swirling mist below. You're not sure if you should jump or step back suddenly. A voice whispers in your ear, "Jump." It's not a command, but a suggestion. You have the choice, but the voice is there, guiding you. Now, what if that voice was God's? Would you still feel free to choose? This is the heart of a centuries-old debate, one that has puzzled philosophers and theologians alike. The question is, if God determines everything that happens, including our choices, can we really be free? And if we're not free, can God be blamed for the evil in the world? In the 17th century, a Swiss Reformed theologian named Francis Turretin tackled this question head-on. Turretin was a fierce defender of Calvinism, a branch of Christianity that emphasizes God's sovereignty over all things, including human choices. But Turretin's arguments are not just for theologians. They touch on fundamental questions about freedom, responsibility, and the nature of God. One of the most common objections to the idea that God determines everything is that it makes God the author of sin. After all, if God controls everything, then he must be responsible for the bad things that happen, right? This is what's known as the common axiom. Turretin, however, argues that this axiom is flawed. Turretin starts by acknowledging that humans are rational creatures who make free choices. He believes that God's determination does not rob us of our genuine freedom. Instead, he distinguishes between two kinds of necessity, one that destroys freedom and another that is compatible with it. Turretin explains that while it's true that whatever God wills happens, it's not the case that whatever God wills happens necessarily. God wills some things to happen contingently, meaning they happen based on certain conditions. For example, if God wills that you choose to help a friend, he does so in a way that allows you to make that choice freely. Turretin argues that even as God decrees what we will do, we still determine ourselves through our own reasoning and will. He says, God does not compel rational creatures or make them act by a physical or brute necessity. Instead, we act in a way that is consistent with our nature and our choices. So, what is human freedom, according to Turretin? Freedom means having the ability to make choices based on our own judgment and will. We can choose to do something even if God has determined that we will do it. This might sound paradoxical, but Turretin believes it's possible because there are two efficient causes of a human action, God and the human agent. God chooses that we do things, but we are the ones who actually do them. Turretin uses the example of a man choosing to eat a hamburger. God may have determined that the man will eat the hamburger, but the man still makes the choice to eat it. The man is the proximate cause of his action, even though God is the ultimate cause. One of the main objections to Turretin's view is that true freedom requires indifference, the ability to choose otherwise. If God has already determined what we will do, how can we truly be free? Turretin responds by distinguishing between two kinds of indifference. The faculty of the will, considered by itself, is indifferent. This means that a person can choose one thing or another. However, the will in operation is not indifferent. Once a person makes a choice, they cannot choose otherwise at that moment. For example, if you decide to eat a hamburger today, you cannot simultaneously decide not to eat it. But you can choose to eat it today and not eat it tomorrow. This is what Turretin means by the will being indifferent in a divided sense. The will can do otherwise at another time, but not at the moment of choice. Another objection to Turretin's view is moral. Some argue that if God determines our choices, we cannot be truly responsible for our actions. This is where Roderick Chisholm, a 20th century philosopher, comes in. Chisholm argues that for us to be responsible, we must be prime movers unmoved. We must have the intrinsic power to cause our actions without any external influence. Turretin would disagree. He believes that while we have the power to make choices, this power is not absolute and independent. Instead, it is limited and dependent on God. Turretin argues that we can still be responsible for our actions, even if God determines them. He points out that God's involvement does not negate our free will. It simply means that our choices are part of a larger divine plan. One of the most challenging aspects of Turretin's view is how it explains God's interaction with evil. If God determines everything, how can He be involved in evil actions without being responsible for them? Turretin distinguishes between the being of an act and its morality. God concurs with the human will differently in good and evil actions. For good actions, God determines the will to do good and ensures that the action is well done. For evil actions, God permits and directs them without causing or approving of the evil itself. Turretin uses the example of Judas betraying Christ. While Judas's act was evil, God's plan was good. God did not cause Judas to betray Christ, but He allowed it to happen and used it for a greater purpose. The guilt for the betrayal rests solely on Judas, not on God. The cliff edge scenario at the beginning of this chapter is a metaphor for the complex relationship between God's sovereignty and human freedom. Turretin's arguments challenge us to think deeply about our choices and our relationship with God. Is the voice whispering in your ear a guide or a dictator? Can you truly be free if God has determined your path? As we delve deeper into Turretin's ideas, we will explore more about how God interacts with our choices, both good and evil. The journey ahead is both challenging and enlightening, and it will force us to question our assumptions about freedom, responsibility, and the nature of God. Turretin, a theologian, tried to explain how God can direct evil without being the author of it. He broke down sin into three parts: the act itself, the wickedness, and the judgment. First, he said that the act itself is something that exists, even if it's bad. We live and move in God, even when we do evil things. But the wickedness, the bad part of the act, has nothing to do with God. God doesn't cause or approve of it. He forbids and punishes it. Finally, the judgment is when God allows the act, uses it for a good purpose, and punishes the wickedness. Some people might say that Turretin is wrong because the wickedness is always part of the act. But Turretin argued that the physical act and our judgment of it are different. For example, he pushed the knife into his chest could mean murder, manslaughter, or even heart surgery. The act itself is neutral. It's the context that makes it right or wrong. Murder is always wrong, but not every killing is murder. The wickedness comes from a person's will, not from God. Turretin also looked at other explanations for how God's providence works. He considered three main ideas: prescience, God knows everything in advance; permission, God allows things to happen; and indifferent flux, God gives a general power to the world. Prescience means God knows everything that will happen. Turretin said, "This doesn't work because if God knows something will happen, it must happen. But if God just knows and doesn't control it, He's not really in charge." This doesn't fit with the idea of God being in control of everything. Permission means God lets things happen, but doesn't cause them. Turretin said. This doesn't work, either because if God just lets things happen, he's not really in control. Also, if God lets everything happen, then his prophecies and foreknowledge wouldn't make sense. God must be more involved than just letting things happen. Indifferent flux means God gives a general power to the world, and people use it to make their own choices, Turretin said. This is like deism, where God creates the world and then steps back. But Turretin believed God is always involved in everything we do. He doesn't just give us power and let us go. He's actively involved in our choices. Turretin believed that God's involvement is both previous, before we make a choice, and simultaneous at the same time as we make a choice. This means God is working in us before and while we make decisions. He's not just watching or letting things happen. He's actively guiding and supporting us. Turretin gave 4 reasons for this view. God is the first cause. God is the one who starts everything. We can't make choices without God's involvement. Before we decide to do something, God is already working in us. God's power is everywhere. God is everywhere and in everything. He doesn't just give us power and step back. He's always present and active. Scripture supports this. The Bible shows that God is actively involved in our lives. For example, in Genesis 50, Joseph's brothers meant to do evil, but God used it for good. In Acts 2, God determined that Jesus would die, even though people chose to kill him. God's love and providence. If God isn't actively involved, he's not really in control, and his love and care for us would be in question. But we know God is in control and loves us, so he must be actively involved in everything we do. Turretin's view is that God is always working in us, guiding and supporting our choices, but he doesn't cause the wickedness. The wickedness comes from our own will, and we are responsible for it. Turretin, a prominent theologian, had a lot to say about how God and human beings interact. He believed that God is always active, even in our free choices. To understand his perspective, let's break down his arguments and the objections people might have. Some people argue that God doesn't need to do anything specific before a person acts. He just sustains our abilities so we can act on our own. Turretin disagreed. He thought that if God merely sustains our abilities, he wouldn't be the prime mover, the one who starts everything. If an action is done by a person alone, without God's direct involvement, then that action would be independent, and God couldn't be considered the first cause. Others might say that divine and human causes are different, but work together, like the different parts of a statue. For example, the sculptor, efficient cause, shapes the clay, material cause, into a statue, formal cause, for a purpose, final cause. In this view, God and humans can act together without any coordination problem. However, Turretin pointed out that only the efficient cause, the sculptor, is an agent, someone who does things. If God is like the clay or the shape, then he isn't an agent, which isn't a position that most Christians would accept. Turretin believed that both God and humans are agents, but in different ways. If God is an agent, he must be involved in our actions, not just sustaining them. This means that either God is always working in and through us, or there's a problem with how he and we coordinate our actions. The former is the Calvinist view, which Turretin supported, while the latter is a problem for non-Calvinists who believe in more human freedom. Turretin also used the idea of act and potency to argue his point. He said that anything that can either act or not act needs to be determined to act by something else. For example, a person's will is like a potential action that needs to be actualized. Turretin believed that only God can do this. Even though we have the power to act, we can't do it without God's power. The universe doesn't sustain itself, God does. Some might object that we have the power within ourselves to bring our will from potential to actual. Turretin agreed that we do have the power to act, but he said that having the power to act is different from having the power to produce a specific action. We need God's previous action to ensure that our choices happen as they do. Turretin also considered how two free wills, God's and ours, can work together. He said there are three ways this can happen. 1, they are joined by a superior cause. 2, they are determined by their nature to act together. Or 3, one determines the other. The first two options don't work, because God can't be subordinate to another cause, and he isn't determined by his nature. So it must be the third option. God determines our actions. This means that God is always in control, even when we make free choices. Another argument Turretin made is about God's eternal decree. Since God's will cannot be frustrated, he must predetermine our wills to act in certain ways. This doesn't mean everything happens by necessity. God can will things to happen contingently. But if God wills something to happen, it will happen. This means that God's will is consistent and coherent. Turretin's arguments show that a general influx, where God just sustains our abilities without being directly involved, is impossible. God must be the prime mover, and he must be involved in our actions to ensure they happen as he wills. This doesn't make God the author of sin, but it does mean he is in control and uses even our evil choices to achieve his purposes. For Turretin, the key is to understand how God can determine an act without determining its immorality. When someone does evil, they freely choose to do what God has prohibited. God is in control, knowing exactly what each person will do when faced with a choice. This means that even though God is in control, we are still responsible for our actions. Turretin's view is often misunderstood. He isn't saying that God ignores secondary causes or that humans have no real freedom. Instead, he believes that God kindly calls us to do freely and willingly all that he has decided we should do. Even the evil we do is used by God to achieve his purposes. God is not the author of sin, but he is its master. Turretin's perspective offers a way to understand how God's providence and human freedom can coexist. It provides a framework for understanding how God can be in control while still allowing us to make real choices. This view offers comfort and peace, knowing that God watches over us and cares for us, even in the midst of our struggles and choices. Imagine a big, powerful king who rules over a vast kingdom. This king, let's call him God, is in control of everything that happens in his kingdom. He knows everything, and he decides everything. Now, some people think that if God is in control of everything, then we can't really be free to make our own choices. But others think that we can still be free and responsible for our actions, even if God is in control. This idea is called compatibilism. Let's dive into some of the big ideas that most Christians believe and see how they fit with the idea that God is in control of everything. God created everything, and he keeps everything in existence. Without God, nothing would exist. If we have the kind of freedom where we can do anything we want completely on our own, then it would be like we can create things too, but only God can create and sustain things. So, This idea of complete freedom, called libertarian free will, doesn't work here. Instead, we can be free in a way that still depends on God. God is completely independent. He doesn't need anything or anyone else. If we have libertarian free will, then God's knowledge of what we will do depends on us. This means God isn't completely independent, which doesn't fit with what most Christians believe. But if we have compatibilist free will, God can know what we will do because He decided it, and He's still completely independent. God is in control of everything that happens. He's not surprised by anything. If we have libertarian free will, then some things happen that God didn't decide, which means He's not in complete control. But if we have compatibilist free will, God is in control of everything, and He knows everything that will happen because He decided it. God is perfect and can't do anything wrong. If we have libertarian free will, then God could choose to do something wrong which doesn't fit with the idea that He's perfect. But if we have compatibilist free will, God can be free and still be perfect, because He can't choose to do anything wrong. God knows everything that will happen, including what we will do. If we have libertarian free will, then we should be able to do something different from what God knows we will do. But if God already knows what we will do, how can we do something different? This is a big problem. But if we have compatibilist free will, God can know what we will do because He decided it, and we can still be free and responsible. The Bible is God's Word, but it was written by human authors. If we have libertarian free will, then the authors could have written something different, which means the Bible might not be exactly what God wanted. But if we have compatibilist free will, the authors can still be free and responsible, and God can ensure that the Bible is exactly what He wanted. When Adam and Eve sinned, it affected everyone. Now, some people think that if we have libertarian free will, we could avoid sinning. But if we can avoid sinning, then we could earn our way into heaven, which isn't what most Christians believe. Instead, if we have compatibilist free will, we can understand that sin is inevitable, and we are still responsible for our actions. Jesus was both fully God and fully human. He never sinned, and He couldn't sin. If we have libertarian free will, it's hard to understand how Jesus could be free and still not sin. But if we have compatibilist free will, Jesus can be free and still not sin, because He's God and can't choose to do anything wrong. These ideas show that compatibilist free will fits better with what most Christians believe about God and the world. It helps us understand how God can be in control of everything, and we can still be free and responsible for our actions. Imagine you have a glass, and I tell you it's fragile. You'd think that means it could break if you dropped it right. But what if I told you that, no matter what, the glass will never break? It doesn't matter if you drop it, throw it, or do anything else. It will always stay intact. Would you still call it fragile? Probably not, because the word fragile implies that it can break under certain conditions. Now, let's think about Jesus. Some people say that Jesus could have sinned, but there was no situation where He would have. This is like saying the glass could break, but it never would. It doesn't make much sense, does it? If Jesus couldn't sin in any situation, then saying He could have sinned doesn't really mean anything. People often separate Jesus' human nature from His divine nature to explain this. They say that if Jesus was just a human, He could have sinned. But because He was also God, He couldn't. But if you believe in libertarian free will, LFW, which means you have the ability to choose freely, this doesn't make sense. If Jesus couldn't have sinned, then He wasn't really free to choose. And if He wasn't free to choose, then he wasn't really morally praiseworthy for not sinning. Let's think about salvation. Some people believe that God's grace is both necessary and sufficient for salvation. This means that you can't be saved without God's grace, and God's grace alone is enough to save you. If God's grace isn't enough, then you must do something to be saved. But if you have to do something to be saved, it means you're performing a moral action. And if you perform a moral action to be saved, you deserve praise for it. But the Bible and Christian tradition say that we can't earn salvation. It's a gift from God. So if God's grace is both necessary and sufficient, then libertarian free will isn't needed for salvation. Now, think about the saints in heaven. When people are in heaven, they won't be able to sin. They will be morally good, but they won't have the ability to choose to do wrong. This shows that you can be morally responsible and good without having the ability to do otherwise. This is a challenge for the idea of libertarian free will, which says you need the ability to choose otherwise to be morally responsible. If you believe in these Christian doctrines, then you might start to see that libertarian free will doesn't fit well with them. Paschabalist free will, CFW, which says that free will and determinism can coexist, might start to look more reasonable. CFW suggests that you can be free and morally responsible even if your actions are determined by God's plan. But there's a big question. If God determines everything, does that make God responsible for evil? Some people argue that if God is the ultimate cause of everything, then he must be the cause of evil actions. But this isn't quite right. When you do something wrong, God isn't doing the wrong thing. He's causing you to do it. It's like the difference between a ball being red and the creator of the ball being red. The ball's properties belong to the ball, not the creator. Think about it this way. If you tell a lie, you're the one who is lying, not God. God's role is different. He's the one who created the situation where you could choose to lie, but he's not the one lying. So, God isn't morally responsible for your actions in the same way you are. Another way to think about it is through the concept of goodness. Goodness is often seen as the absence of evil. If something is good, it means it doesn't lack anything it should have. Evil, on the other hand, is a lack or a privation of something good. For example, if you have a perfect apple, it's good. If the apple has a bruise, the bruise is a privation of the apple's perfection. God, being perfect, doesn't create evil. He creates good things. When evil happens, it's a lack or a privation in the good things God created. So, even if God determines everything, it doesn't mean he's responsible for evil in the way that we are. God's role is to create and sustain the world, and he does this in a way that allows for free choices, even if those choices sometimes lead to evil. This doesn't make God evil or responsible for evil in the same way we are. In the end, thinking about these ideas can help us understand how God's sovereignty and human free will can coexist in a way that makes sense with Christian doctrine. It might be a bit tricky, but it's worth considering to see how these beliefs fit together. Christians often talk about God being all good and responsible for everything good, but not for anything bad. This idea can be confusing, especially when we think about evil and suffering in the world. To understand this better, let's break it down into simpler terms. First, let's talk about what evil is, according to a theory called the privation theory of evil. Evil isn't a thing or a property, like being tall or short. Instead, evil is the absence of something that should be there. For example, if someone is blind, the evil is the absence of sight, which should be present in a human being. The idea is that evil is a lack or a missing part, not a real thing on its own. Now, let's think about goodness. In Christian philosophy, goodness and existence are the same thing. This means that when something exists, it is good. God, being the source of all existence, is the ultimate goodness. So, everything that exists is good because God made it exist. But since evil is just a lack of something, it doesn't really exist in the same way. It's like a hole in a wall. There's nothing there, but it's still a problem. This idea helps explain why God isn't responsible for evil. God creates everything that exists, and everything that exists is good. But evil, being a lack of something, isn't something God creates. It's like saying God can't create a hole. A hole is just the absence of something. Some people might still ask, if God can create everything good, why doesn't He prevent evil from happening? This is a good question. One answer is that God doesn't have to create anything at all. Creating is a free choice for God. If God didn't create anything, He wouldn't be doing anything wrong. So if God chooses to create, He isn't obligated to create everything perfectly or to prevent every bad thing from happening. But what about after God creates? Once God has created the world, does He have new obligations? For example, if I have a child, I have obligations to take care of that child. But God's relationship to creation is different. God isn't just maintaining something that already exists. He is continually creating and sustaining everything. It's like saying God is always making the world exist, not just keeping it going. So God doesn't have the same kind of obligations that we do. Another way to think about it is that sometimes the absence of something can lead to greater goods. For example, if I never faced challenges, I might not grow as a person. God might allow some absences or evils to happen because they lead to greater goods that wouldn't be possible otherwise. This doesn't mean God likes evil, but it means He sees a bigger picture. Now, let's talk about the idea of hell. Some people think that the idea of hell is incompatible with God's goodness and love. They argue that a loving God wouldn't allow anyone to suffer forever. But if we understand God's goodness and love in the way we've discussed, this problem can be addressed. God's goodness means that He creates and sustains everything. And this act of creation is an act of love. Even if someone ends up in hell, God is still loving them by giving them existence. Hell is a state of being separated from God, which is a lack of a right relationship with God. But God isn't obligated to force everyone into a right relationship with Him, just like God isn't obligated to create anything. He isn't obligated to make everyone choose Him. Love, in this context, is about willing goodness for others. God's act of creating and sustaining is an act of willing goodness. So, even in hell, God is still loving those people by giving them existence. The difference is that the people in hell have chosen a path that leads to separation from God, and God respects their choice. In the end, the idea that God is all good and not responsible for evil can be understood by thinking about evil as a lack, goodness as existence, and God's free choice to create. God's love and goodness are shown in His act of creation, and He isn't obligated to prevent every bad thing from happening, or to force everyone into a right relationship with him. This helps explain why the traditional idea of hell can still be compatible with God's goodness and love. In the world of theology and philosophy, one of the most intriguing topics is how God, who is often described as perfect and all-good, can make choices that seem to favor some people over others. This idea is central to the Calvinist or Augustinian perspective, which sees God's actions as not just loving but also discriminatory. But what does this mean? And how can it be reconciled with the idea of God's perfect goodness? When we talk about God's creation, we often think of it as an act of love. However, from a Calvinist or Augustinian viewpoint, this creation is also an act of choice. God didn't have to create this particular universe. He could have chosen a different one. This means that the act of creation itself involves discrimination. For example, if God chose to create a universe where you and I exist, but your sister doesn't, it's not that your sister is being unfairly treated. It's simply that God chose to actualize some possibilities and not others. There's no shadowy existence for the unchosen. They simply remain possibilities. This idea of God's choice extends beyond creation. In the Bible, we see God making specific choices about who to bless and who to pass over. For instance, God chose Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but not Ishmael or Esau. He chose the nation of Israel, and through them, the Messiah, Jesus. Even Jesus, in his ministry, chose to help some people and not others, to go to certain towns and not to others. This selective choice is a theme that runs throughout the Bible, and it's a key aspect of how God operates in the world. But how can a perfect, all-good God make such choices? Doesn't this seem unfair? To understand this, we need to look at the concept of God as the greatest being. In the book of Hebrews, it's said that God, when making a promise to Abraham, swore by himself because there was no one greater. This suggests that God is the greatest being in every way. No one and nothing can surpass him in any attribute. This idea is called perfect being theology, and it's a way of thinking about God as the ultimate standard of greatness. However, this raises a question. If God is the greatest in every way, how can he make choices that seem to favor some over others? Isn't that inconsistent with being all good? The answer lies in understanding God's perfect goodness in a different way. God's goodness is not about treating everyone the same. It's about acting in the best way possible. Sometimes, the best way to act involves making choices that benefit some more than others. For example, God's choice to make a covenant with Abraham was not unfair. It was part of a larger plan to bring about good for the world. This idea is also seen in the way God interacts with the world. God's actions are not random. They are intentional and purposeful. When God chooses to bless someone or to help someone, it's not arbitrary. It's part of a plan that, in the end, is meant to bring about the greatest good. This is why, in the Bible, God's choices are often described as acts of love, even if they seem discriminatory from a human perspective. So, when we think about God's choices, we need to remember that God's perfect goodness is not about treating everyone the same. It's about acting in the best way possible, even if that means making choices that seem to favor some over others. This doesn't mean that God is unfair. It means that God's actions are always guided by his perfect wisdom and love. In the end, the idea of God's discriminatory choices is a complex one, but it's a key part of understanding how God interacts with the world. It's a reminder that God's ways are not always our ways, but they are always guided by his perfect goodness and wisdom. As we wrap up our exploration of God's perfect goodness and omnibenevolence, let's take a step back and reflect on what we've learned. We've delved into some deep and complex ideas, but at the heart of it all is a simple question. What does it mean for God to be perfectly good and benevolent? When we think about God's goodness, we often imagine a being who is all loving, all caring, and always doing what's best for everyone. But this idea of God's goodness has evolved over time. In the past, many thinkers, like Anselm, focused on God's goodness as the source of all creation. They believed that everything is good because it comes from God, and that God's goodness is expressed in the very existence of the world and everything in it. However, in modern times, the focus has shifted. Today, many people see God's goodness primarily in terms of benevolence, God's love and care for His creatures. This means that God is not just the source of all being, but also the one who actively provides for and protects us, ensuring our well-being and happiness. But this raises a big question. If God is all good and all-powerful, why is there evil in the world? This is known as the problem of evil, and it has puzzled people for centuries. Some argue that if God is truly omnibenevolent, He would eliminate all evil. But others, like Alvin Plantinga, suggest that God's benevolence includes giving us free will, even if it means we sometimes choose to do bad things. Jeff Jordan, a modern philosopher, challenges the idea that God's love must be flat and wide, that is equally distributed to everyone in the same way. Jordan argues that the deepest and most meaningful expressions of love are often partial. Just as we naturally love our family and friends more than strangers, God's love might also have a more focused, personal aspect. This doesn't mean God loves some people more than others in a bad way, but rather that God's love is tailored to each person's unique needs and circumstances. This idea can be hard to grasp, especially when we think about how God might allow one person to suffer for the benefit of another. But Jordan suggests that in a world where people have different needs and circumstances, it's not possible for God to fulfill everyone's deepest desires all at once. Sometimes, what's best for one person might not be what's best for another. Another way to think about God's benevolence is to consider the natural differences in our world. Some people are born into different families, live in different places, and have different abilities. These differences are a fundamental part of what it means to be human. If God's love were truly flat and wide, it might overlook these differences and fail to address the unique needs of each person. In the end, the mystery of God's perfect goodness and benevolence remains. We can't fully understand God's ways, and we may never know exactly how God's love is distributed. But we can trust that God's love is real and that it is always working for our good, even when we don't see it. As we reflect on these ideas, we might find comfort in the words of the Bible, which tell us that God is good to all and that His mercy extends to everyone. Even if we don't understand everything, we can take heart in the knowledge that God's love is a constant presence in our lives, guiding us through the ups and downs of the human experience. So as we conclude, let's hold on to the belief that God's perfect goodness and benevolence are real, even if they sometimes seem mysterious. In a world full of complexity and uncertainty, this belief can be a source of hope and strength.